They laughed at the poor black waitress, humiliating her in front of everyone. They thought money gave them the right to do anything, until the Hells Angels walked into the diner. What happened next changed their lives forever and made the whole town talk about it. Subscribe to the channel and comment below which country you're watching this video from. The heat on Route 66 seemed endless, shimmering above the cracked asphalt like a mirage that refused to fade. The air smelled of gasoline, dust, and something sweet. Perhaps the cherry pie that had been sitting in the diner window since morning. A faded neon sign buzzed weakly above the entrance. Route 66 Diner. The kind of place that time forgot, where the jukebox still played songs from the 70s, and the coffee never truly went cold because someone was always there to refill it. Inside, the rhythmic sound of a spatula hitting the grill blended with the low hum of conversation and the occasional hiss of the coffee machine. It was another long afternoon for Lila Johnson. She moved between tables with practiced ease, her uniform a little faded, her smile a little tired, yet her presence had warmth that reached every corner of the room. Lila was 23, slender, dark-skinned, with eyes that held quiet strength. Life had taken plenty from her, comfort, rest, and freedom, but it had never managed to steal her grace. Her co-workers often wondered how she could remain kind after so many years of struggle. But to Lila, kindness wasn't a luxury, it was survival. She poured coffee for a trucker, refilled a sugar jar, wiped the counter with circular motions that had become second nature. "You good today, Frank?" she asked the man at the corner booth. "As long as your coffee stays this strong, I might live another day," he replied with a grin. She laughed softly, brushing back a strand of hair that had escaped her ponytail. The world outside was restless, but inside the diner, everything followed its own slow rhythm. The cracked clock above the register ticked a little behind, the jukebox skipped the same verse in an old Eagles song, and the sunlight that spilled through the dusty blinds painted long golden lines across the floor. For the regulars, the diner wasn't just a stop, it was a small piece of humanity that hadn't yet been paved over by progress. And for Lila, it was her world, her stage, her duty, and her dream all at once. When her shift ended at dusk, she stepped out into the heavy air. The sky was bleeding orange into purple, and the roar of engines echoed faintly down the highway. She walked home along the narrow road that led to the trailer park, the gravel crunching under her worn sneakers. The trailer she shared with her mother sat on the far edge of the park, where the street lights flickered and the crickets sang loud enough to drown out the silence. Inside, the dim light of a bedside lamp revealed her mother, Ruth, lying on an old couch, the oxygen machine humming beside her. "You're late again, baby," Ruth whispered, smiling weakly. "Had a full house today," Lila said, kissing her mother's forehead. "I brought you soup from the diner, and a little pie, too." Ruth chuckled, though her breathing was shallow. "You're spoiling me." Lila sat on the edge of the couch, untying her apron. The coins in her pocket jingled, a small reminder of how far she still had to go to afford her mother's medicine. She opened her old notebook, the one where she kept every tip counted and every bill calculated. The pages were filled with numbers, circles, and reminders written in neat handwriting. Rent due next Friday. Mom's prescription, $210. Car battery dying, find used one. She sighed and closed it. From the window, she could see the lights of passing trucks on the highway, the same lights that had kept her company since she was a little girl. Somewhere deep inside, she still believed that if she kept walking this road, something good might eventually find her. Later that evening, the familiar thunder of engines rolled through the valley. The sound wasn't menacing, it was alive. 20 motorcycles came roaring down the highway, their headlights cutting through the dusk. The ground trembled slightly as they slowed near the diner. Lila smiled to herself. The Hells Angels were back. She returned to work the next morning before sunrise, and by the time she flipped the open sign, the bikes were already parked outside. Their chrome gleamed in the morning light, lined up like metallic soldiers. The men who rode them looked rough to anyone passing by, leather vests, tattoos, long beards. But to Lila, they were just family. When the first one stepped in, the bell above the door gave its tired chime. "Morning, Angel," said the biggest of them, a tall man with a silver beard and a thunderous voice. His name was Mike Grizzly Harris, though everyone simply called him Bear. Lila smiled warmly. "Morning, Bear. You want your usual?" "You know me too well," he replied, settling onto his stool at the counter. The others followed, filling the diner with laughter and the sound of heavy boots against the floor. To the untrained eye, they were intimidating, but the way they spoke to Lila with respect, even protectiveness, revealed something softer. She served them coffee, teasing them about their stories, pretending to scold them when their jokes got too loud. "You boys better not scare off my paying customers," she said, placing a plate of pancakes in front of one of them. Bear grinned. "We're the reason this place stays alive, Angel." "You're the reason I have to mop twice a day," she shot back, and the room erupted in laughter. In those moments, she forgot the exhaustion, the bills, the loneliness. Around them, she felt safe. It was strange these men, feared by many, treated her with a gentleness that others rarely did. When a new customer once made a rude comment about her skin, Bear had simply stood up, looked the man in the eyes and said, "That's our sister you're talking to." No one ever dared to speak ill of her again. As the day wore on, talk turned to the news. One of the bikers folded his newspaper and muttered, "You hear about that developer? Woods or whatever his name is. Buying up land all along the stretch." "Yeah," another added. "They say he's planning to turn half of Route 66 into shopping malls and gas stations." Bear grunted. "Wouldn't surprise me. Men like that see the world in dollar signs." Lila poured more coffee into his cup. "Maybe it won't reach here," she said softly. Bear looked at her for a moment, his gray eyes steady. "If it does, we'll handle it." That night after closing, Lila lingered by the window, wiping the counter even though it was spotless. The neon sign flickered weakly, the buzzing sound filling the silence. She glanced at the map of Route 66 pinned to the wall, its corners curling, the paper yellowed with age. Red pins marked the places she had dreamed of seeing one day. Santa Fe, Flagstaff, Amarillo. The road looked endless, like hope itself. She placed her hand on the glass, tracing the lines of the highway with her fingertip. Outside, the bikes roared to life again. Bear gave her a small nod through the window before leading his crew into the night. As the last taillight disappeared down the road, Lila felt the silence close in. She turned off the lights, locked the door, and stood for a moment on the steps of the diner. The night was vast and warm, the stars scattered across it like sugar on black velvet. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, a storm forming on the horizon. She didn't know it yet, but it wasn't weather, it was change, and it was coming for everyone on Route 66. She took one last look at the diner before heading home. The sign buzzed behind her, casting a faint red glow that reflected in her eyes. Tomorrow would be another day, another shift, another set of strangers to greet with a smile. But beneath that smile, something had begun to stir, an unspoken sense that the world she knew was about to collide with one she didn't belong to. As she walked down the gravel road, a faint wind carried the smell of rain and motor oil. She pulled her jacket tighter and whispered to herself, "No matter what comes, I'll keep smiling." It wasn't just a promise, it was her armor. And as the first raindrops touched the dust, Route 66 shimmered under the glow of the distant lightning, waiting for the story that was about to begin. The next morning arrived wrapped in sunlight that seemed almost too gentle for what the day would bring. The storm that had brushed against the diner the night before left behind clean air and a strange stillness. The cracked road shimmered beneath the early light in the sign of Route 66. Diner hummed again, its neon glow fighting against the brightness of the new day. Inside, everything looked ordinary. The scent of bacon, the sound of coffee being poured, the rhythmic scrape of a spatula against the grill. But there was a peculiar tension in the air, something that Lila couldn't quite name. She had opened the doors early as always, her movements slow and steady, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her apron freshly washed and pressed. By mid-morning, the regulars filled the booths, the old couple who shared a single slice of pie every Wednesday, the truckers laughing about potholes big enough to swallow a car. Two of the bikers sat at the counter, drinking their third cup of coffee. It was one of those peaceful days when time seemed to stretch, and everything felt just right, until the noise of expensive tires cut through the calm like a blade. The sound didn't belong to Route 66. It was too sharp, too clean, too arrogant. Through the window, Lila saw a line of black SUVs glide to a stop outside the diner. They looked completely out of place against the dusty landscape and the row of rusted gas pumps. The engines died one by one, and 4 young people stepped out, laughing loudly as if they owned the world. Their clothes were crisp, their sunglasses mirrored, and their confidence filled the air like perfume. Lila's heart sank a little. She had seen their kind before. Rich kids passing through the old highway for fun, mocking what they didn't understand. She adjusted her apron and whispered quietly to herself, "Just another table. Be kind. Always be kind." The door swung open, and the little brass bell jingled, its cheerful sound clashing with the swagger of the newcomers. The one who entered first was a tall, handsome young man with perfect hair and a smirk that seemed permanently fixed to his face. Dressed in designer jeans and a white shirt that probably cost more than her week's wages, he looked around with disdain. This was Dylan Woods, the son of the powerful billionaire rumored to be buying up the old highway. Behind him came 3 others, a blonde girl chewing gum with the confidence of royalty, a boy with a camera who was already filming the place like it was an exotic zoo, and another young man who carried himself with the lazy arrogance of someone who had never heard the word no. "God, this place looks ancient," the blonde said, wrinkling her nose. "It smells like fried oil and sadness." Her friends laughed. Dylan walked forward, dragging a stool with his foot before sitting at the counter, snapping his fingers lightly. "Hey, waitress," he said. "We're starving. Let's see what you've got." Lila turned, her expression calm, though she felt the stares of the bikers at the counter tighten like coiled springs. "Good morning," she said gently. "Would you like to sit at a booth? I can bring menus right over." "One will sit wherever we damn please," said the one with the camera. He filmed her briefly, laughing. "Smile, you're going viral." Lila ignored the comment, placed menus on the counter, and asked quietly, "Would you like some water while you decide?" Dylan looked up at her with mock surprise. "Water? Sweetheart, I drink imported sparkling. Got anything that fancy here?" His friends laughed again, high-pitched and empty. Lila didn't answer. She turned away, wrote down their drinks, and went back to the counter to pour coffee for one of the truckers. The bikers, still sitting nearby, exchanged glances. Grizzly Harris set down his mug. "You want me to say something?" one of the men asked him under his breath. Bear shook his head slowly. "Not yet." When Lila returned with their drinks, the laughter had grown louder. The blonde had pulled out her phone and was filming the interior of the diner. "Can you believe people still eat here?" she said to her audience online. "It's like stepping into a museum for the poor." Lila placed the glasses of water carefully in front of each of them, pretending not to hear. "Your food will be ready soon," she said softly. "Thank you for waiting." Dylan leaned back in his chair, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "You're very proper, aren't you? Tell me something. How long have you been serving burgers to strangers on this godforsaken road?" "Long enough to know that every stranger has a story," she replied, keeping her voice steady, "and long enough to know you learn more by listening than talking." That response silenced him for a moment. He looked at her, almost puzzled, before his smirk returned. "Cute," he said, "but I didn't come here for philosophy." When their food arrived, he picked up the burger with 2 fingers as though it were contaminated. "You call this a meal?" he said loudly. "Looks like garbage." His friends laughed again, one of them snapping a picture. "Send that to my dad," Dylan said mockingly. "He should see what passes for food in his future property." Lila's smile trembled slightly, but she held it in place. "I'm sorry if it's not to your liking," she said quietly. "I can make another one." But Dylan wasn't done. Something in him, boredom, ego, cruelty, wanted more. He looked at her, eyes cold and playful at the same time. Then slowly he leaned back, smirked, and spat directly onto her apron. The sound was small but deafening. The diner froze. Even the jukebox seemed to stop mid-song. Lila stood there motionless, the spit running down the faded fabric, her hands trembling as she tried to breathe. The humiliation burned deep, but she didn't let it break her. She took a napkin from her pocket, wiped her apron, and said softly, "I'm sorry, sir." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, but she stayed standing, head high. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room like thunder before a storm. The bikers behind her moved almost in unison. Grizzly Harris rose from his stool, his massive frame casting a shadow across the counter. The scrape of his chair on the floor sounded heavier than any shout could have been. Every step he took echoed. The other bikers followed, their boots hitting the tiles like slow drum beats. Dylan turned, his smirk faltering. "Hey, what's your problem?" he said, forcing a laugh. Grizzly stopped in front of him, towering over the table. "You think money makes you better than her?" His voice was low, steady, and dangerous. "That girl works harder in one day than you've ever worked in your life." Dylan blinked, his confidence shrinking. I was just joking, man. Relax." The biker leaned closer, his beard almost brushing the young man's shoulder. "No, you weren't joking, but you're about to learn what respect means." Outside, the rest of the Hells Angels started their engines. The sound rolled through the air like distant thunder, shaking the glass of the windows. The entire diner seemed to vibrate with their power. Grizzly gestured toward the door. "You and your friends outside." Dylan hesitated. "What, are you going to beat us up?" Grizzly's eyes narrowed. "No, we're going to do something worse. We're going to make you understand." The boys rose slowly, their arrogance dissolving into fear. They followed the bikers outside, surrounded by the sound of roaring engines. No one in the diner spoke. Lila stood still by the counter, watching through the window, her heart racing. She didn't want violence, but she also couldn't stop the strange satisfaction that flickered in her chest. Through the glass, she saw Grizzly talking to Dylan. The older man's voice was calm, almost fatherly, but his tone carried the weight of command. "Tomorrow morning you're coming back here," he said. "Not as customers, as workers. You're going to clean, serve, and learn what it means to respect people who don't need money to have dignity. You understand me?" Dylan nodded mutely, his face pale. His friends nodded too. Grizzly stepped back, and the engines revved louder. Then one by one the bikes roared away, leaving only dust and silence in their wake. When the door opened again, Lila was still standing there, her eyes glassy, her apron stained. Grizzly walked back in, his boots heavy, his gaze soft when it landed on her. "You all right, Angel?" he asked quietly. She nodded slowly. "You didn't have to do that?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I did." As he turned to leave, she said, "What if they don't come back?" "Oh, they will," he said, opening the door. "Rich boys like that never learn unless someone makes them. We'll make them." That night, when Lila closed the diner, she stood for a long time by the window, staring out at the dark road. She felt shaken, but also strangely lighter. For once, someone had stood up for her, not because she was weak, but because she mattered. It wasn't anger she felt. It was something deeper. The sound of engines fading into the night became the lullaby of justice she hadn't known she needed. What she didn't realize was that this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the lesson that would change both her world and theirs forever. The sun rose slowly over Route 66, spilling gold across the highway as if to soften what the night before had hardened. The storm of the previous evening lingered only in the form of damp dust on the ground and the faint scent of rain. But inside the diner, the air felt different. Everyone who stepped in that morning had already heard the story. Rumors traveled fast along the old road. How a rich boy had humiliated the waitress everyone loved, and how the Hells Angels had stepped in to teach him a lesson. By sunrise, half the county knew about it, and by mid-morning, even the radio hosts were talking about the diner incident. Lila tried not to listen. She wiped down the counter, refilled the coffee pots, and smiled at regulars as if nothing had changed. But she felt it. Something had shifted. She wasn't invisible anymore. When Grizzly Harris walked in, the room seemed to settle. The giant of a man nodded to a few people and sat at his usual spot by the counter. Lila poured him coffee before he even asked. "Heard the news?" he asked in his gravelly voice. "It's everywhere." She sighed softly. "I don't like being the center of attention." "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "They did, and today they're going to learn it." Outside, a sleek black car slowed to a stop near the diner. It wasn't one of the SUVs from yesterday. This one was smaller, classier, the kind of car that didn't belong on cracked asphalt. Dylan Woods stepped out, dressed simply this time. Jeans, sneakers, and a plain gray t-shirt. The confidence that had marked his every move yesterday was gone, replaced by unease. His father's angry words still echoed in his mind from the night before. "You embarrass this family. Fix it before the press makes a circus out of it." The diner fell quiet when he entered. Conversations died mid-sentence. The sound of the door closing seemed too loud. Lila turned and froze for a moment, her hand still holding the coffee pot. Dylan walked toward the counter, stopping a few feet away. "I'm here," he said, his voice low but steady. Grizzly turned slowly on his stool and nodded. "Good. You remember what I told you?" "Yes, sir," Dylan answered. "I'm here to work." Grizzly slid a clean apron across the counter. "Then let's begin." At first, the sight of him in an apron was almost absurd. The son of a billionaire, cleaning tables at a roadside diner where a meal cost less than his watch. Some of the regulars chuckled quietly, others shook their heads. Lila watched him in silence, unsure how to feel. Part of her wanted to resent him, to enjoy the humiliation he was feeling. But another part, deeper, gentler, felt pity. Dylan started by wiping tables. His movements were clumsy, mechanical. He had never worked with his hands before. The cloth slipped, the plates clattered, and the customers watched with mixed amusement and satisfaction. When one of the truckers called out, "Hey, rich boy, missed a spot," Dylan bit back a retort and kept scrubbing. Every second in that apron burned through his pride like fire through dry wood. At the counter, Lila refilled cups and avoided looking at him, but she noticed the way his shoulders hunched, the way his face tightened each time someone whispered. It wasn't the same arrogance she had seen before. It was discomfort, even shame. At one point, he dropped a plate. The crash silenced the diner for a moment. He bent to pick up the pieces and Lila hurried over. "Careful," she said quietly. "You'll cut yourself." Their eyes met briefly. He opened his mouth to speak, but she walked away before he could. Hours passed. He mopped floors, carried dishes, and washed plates until his fingers were pruned. Sweat soaked through his shirt and his back ached from bending over the sink. When he finally stopped to rest, Grizzly handed him a rag. "You done already?" he asked. "No, sir," Dylan muttered and went back to work. By evening, his hands were shaking from exhaustion. Lila was locking the register when he approached her cautiously. "Can I ask you something?" She didn't look up. "What?" "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You could have said no. You could have told them to let it go." Lila finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Because you need to understand something," she said softly. "You think I wanted revenge? That's not who I am. You humiliated me yesterday, but what really matters is that you didn't even see me. To you, I wasn't a person, just someone to mock. So if this helps you see people differently, maybe it's worth it." He stood in silence, the weight of her words sinking in deeper than any punishment. For the first time, he didn't have a clever reply. When he left that night, the world looked different. The neon lights seemed harsher, the road lonelier. His expensive car felt out of place on the cracked pavement. At home, his father was waiting, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Well?" he asked. Dylan looked at him, suddenly realizing how much they resembled each other, not in appearance, but in the coldness they carried. "I'll go back tomorrow," he said. His father frowned. "You'll do what I tell you. This ends tonight." "No," Dylan replied quietly. "It doesn't." For once, his father had no words. The next morning, he returned to the diner before opening time. Lila was outside sweeping the steps. She looked surprised to see him. "You didn't have to come today," she said. "I told them I'd stay for a week," he replied. "I keep my word." She studied him for a moment, then handed him the broom. "Then start here." That week, something began to change. At first, he worked out of obligation. But by the third day, he began to notice things he had never cared to before. The way Lila smiled at old customers who tipped her with change. The way she helped the old man with shaking hands drink his coffee without spilling. The quiet gratitude in people's faces when she said, "Take care, come back safe." It was work, real work, rooted not in money, but in meaning. One evening, when the last customer left, Dylan sat by the counter, too tired to speak. Lila wiped down the tables while humming softly. "Doesn't it bother you?" he asked suddenly. "What?" she said without looking up. Working so hard every day. For so little. She paused and smiled faintly. It used to, but you stop thinking about what you don't have when you start being grateful for what you do. He thought about that long after she left. That night he sat in his car outside her trailer park, engine off, watching from a distance as she carried groceries inside. He saw the light flicker through the window and the shadow of her mother on the couch. He realized then that he had no idea what real struggle was. When he came back the next morning, his sleeves were rolled up, and he didn't wait for anyone to tell him what to do. He served coffee, cleaned, and even made small talk with customers. The regulars began nodding to him with something close to respect. Grizzly noticed and smiled. "Not bad, kid," he said. Dylan shrugged, but there was a trace of pride in his eyes. By the end of the week, his arrogance had faded. What replaced it wasn't guilt, but understanding. He started to see the diner not as a punishment, but as a mirror. In the reflection, he didn't see the rich man's son anymore. He saw someone new, someone who could make things right. When his last day came, he lingered after closing time. Lila sat outside on the steps, staring at the stars. The hum of the highway stretched in the distance. Dylan sat beside her, silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "I wanted to say I'm sorry." The words sounded clumsy but real. Not just for what I did, but for the way I thought. I didn't know people could have this much strength. She turned her head slightly. "You learned something this week." "Yeah," he said. "That respect isn't given because of money. It's earned." For the first time since they met, she smiled at him, not out of politeness, but out of genuine warmth. Then maybe this wasn't a waste after all. The lights from passing cars swept across their faces for a moment, like a quiet applause from the road itself. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. Both knew that something had shifted, something neither punishment nor pride could ever undo. That night, for the first time in years, Dylan slept without the noise of guilt or entitlement. The lesson had begun to take root, though neither of them yet understood how deeply it would grow. And as dawn approached, the sound of motorcycles echoed again down the highway, a reminder that every road, no matter how broken, can still lead somewhere worth going. The days that followed unfolded like a quiet rhythm, steady and unhurried, as if the diner itself was watching over the transformation taking place beneath its roof. The rumor of the rich kid's punishment had already lost its edge. The town had moved on, though whispers still circled about how the son of a billionaire had been washing dishes for tips. For Lila, it was simpler. Another day, another shift, another pot of coffee that needed refilling. Yet something had changed, not in the world around her, but in the man who now came to work beside her every morning. Dylan was no longer the boy who flinched at sweat or grimaced at dirt under his nails. He arrived early, spoke less, and listened more. The arrogance had drained from his posture, replaced by a quiet resolve that surprised even himself. Each morning began the same way. Lila unlocked the door, flicked on the lights, and was greeted by the comforting smell of coffee brewing. Dylan followed a few minutes later, often carrying a box of supplies from the market or sweeping the sidewalk before she could tell him not to. He didn't try to impress anyone. He simply worked. Sometimes they barely exchanged words for hours, their communication reduced to small gestures, a shared glance when the rush came in, a silent nod when one needed help at the counter. And in those silences, something fragile but unmistakable began to take shape. One evening, when the last customer left and the sound of the jukebox faded into a low hum, Dylan was wiping down tables while Lila counted the cash register. The diner was bathed in amber light, the air thick with the smell of coffee and rain. Outside, thunder murmured far away. "You ever get tired of this?" he asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. She looked up from the receipts. "Of what?" "Of pretending everything's fine." His voice was calm, not accusatory, just curious. Lila smiled faintly. "It's not pretending," she said. "It's surviving." Dylan leaned on his mop, watching her. "You work harder than anyone I've ever met, and you still manage to smile." "I don't get it." She shrugged. "Smiling doesn't mean I'm not tired. It just means I'm still here." She closed the cash drawer and turned to him. You'd be surprised how far that alone can take you. When they stepped outside, the night air was cool and heavy. The neon sign flickered behind them, painting their shadows in shades of red and gold. Lila locked the door and started walking down the road toward the trailer park. Dylan followed her for a few steps before calling out, "Let me give you a ride." She shook her head. "No need." "It's late," he insisted, "and it's a long walk." She hesitated, then finally nodded. "Fine, just to the gate." The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the car filling the silence between them. The headlights carved a path through the dark, revealing fleeting glimpses of desert brush and cracked road signs. Dylan kept his eyes on the road. "You always walk this far every night?" "Every night," she said softly. "The diner's the only place hiring steady, and Mom can't be left alone too long, so I come straight home." He glanced at her, the glow of the dashboard softening her features. "How long has she been sick?" "A few years now. Some days are better, some aren't. I try not to think about it too much. If I do, I'll stop moving." Her voice was steady, but something inside it cracked like dry glass. Dylan didn't know what to say. He had never been close to struggle. He'd grown up surrounded by people who treated hardship like an abstract concept. Now, sitting beside her, he felt the smallness of his own life in the face of hers. When they reached the trailer park, she pointed toward a row of dimly lit homes. "That's me," she said. "Thanks for the ride." He put the car in park. "Can I ask you something?" "If it's about the coffee recipe, it's a secret," she joked, smiling faintly. "No," he said. "I just wanted to know why you never got angry about what I did." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the glow of the dashboard. "Anger doesn't fix anything," she said. "It just eats you alive from the inside. You humiliated me, yes, but if I'd let that anger control me, it would have turned me into someone I don't want to be." She paused, studying his face. "Maybe the reason you're still here is because, deep down, you don't want to be that person either." For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of cicadas filled the space between them. Then she stepped out of the car, closed the door, and said quietly through the open window, "See you tomorrow, Dylan." He watched her walk up the narrow path to the small trailer. Through the window, he saw a faint light and the silhouette of her mother on the couch. He stayed there for a while, listening to the distant rumble of motorcycles far down the highway before finally driving off. That night he couldn't sleep. The image of her walking alone on the dark road lingered in his mind. The next morning he arrived at the diner even earlier than usual. Lila found him already inside, fixing the old coffee machine that had been leaking for weeks. "What are you doing?" she asked, amused. "Trying to keep this dinosaur alive," he replied. "Figured it's done more work than I have, so it deserves a break." She laughed softly, the sound light and genuine. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, "but I want to." Hours later, during the afternoon rush, the machine sputtered once, then began to work perfectly again. "Guess you've got the magic touch," she said. "Don't tell anyone," he replied. "It'll ruin my reputation." Their eyes met, and for the first time since they'd met, they both laughed without tension, without pretense. It was that same evening that Dylan overheard something he wasn't meant to. Grizzly had stopped by for coffee, as he did most nights. He was sitting at the counter, reading the newspaper, when one of the truckers mentioned, "You hear about that land deal up north? Woods Construction buying up half the highway. They're saying this place is next." Grizzly lowered the paper, frowning. "That right?" "Word is, they'll tear it all down. Diner, gas stations, everything. Big shopping complex coming in." Dylan froze where he stood, tray in hand. His father's name hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew his father had projects all over the state, but he hadn't realized this stretch of highway was part of them. When Lila came out from the back, he was still standing there, pale and quiet. "You okay?" she asked. He forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." That night as he drove home, the weight of what he'd learned pressed on him. The road that had once felt endless now seemed like a countdown, every mile marker a reminder of what was coming. His father's empire was built on profit, not people, and the diner was nothing but another obstacle in the way of progress. But now it wasn't just some diner. It was Lila's life, her livelihood, her mother's medicine, her entire world. when he walked into his father's study later that evening. The man was on the phone, his voice calm and commanding. "Yes, the purchase goes through next week. The diner's just an old building, no problem clearing it." Dylan stepped forward. "Don't do it." His father glanced at him, surprised. "What did you say?" "Don't buy the land. Don't tear down the diner." The older man set the phone down slowly. "You're joking." "I'm not," Dylan said firmly. "Those people have nowhere else to go. You'll destroy their lives for another parking lot." His father laughed, shaking his head. "You've been spending too much time with those drifters. You don't understand business." "Maybe I don't," Dylan replied, his voice rising. "But I understand people now." For the first time, the two men faced each other, not as father and son, but as two strangers standing on opposite sides of a line drawn by conscience. "You're not going to stop me," the older man said coldly. "Watch me," Dylan answered, turning away. Later, he drove back to the diner, parking across the road. The neon sign flickered in the distance, steady and defiant. Inside, he could see Lila cleaning up, unaware of the storm that was about to hit her world. Dylan leaned against the car, watching her silhouette move across the window. He felt the same fear he had once caused in her, a quiet dread of something too big to fight. But this time, he wasn't running from it. He was preparing to stand against it. As the night deepened, a convoy of motorcycles thundered down the highway, their lights glowing like a moving constellation. The sound filled the air, a promise of loyalty and strength. Dylan looked toward the road, then back at the diner. For the first time in his life, he knew what he had to do. The boy who had come to mock and humiliate had become a man who was ready to protect. And as he sat there under the wide, star-filled sky, one thought repeated in his mind like a prayer. Respect isn't inherited, it's earned. The following morning arrived with an uneasy quiet. The air felt heavy, as though the road itself sensed what was about to unfold. The diner opened at its usual time, but something inside Lila had shifted. Dylan hadn't shown up early as he usually did, and the emptiness of his absence felt sharper than she expected. She tried to ignore the feeling and busied herself with cleaning, preparing coffee, greeting regulars with her usual smile. But even as she moved through the motions, a strange tension lingered behind her calm expression, like a storm forming behind clear skies. It wasn't until mid-morning that the bell over the door rang and Dylan stepped inside. His face was pale, his jaw set. He looked like someone who hadn't slept, and the moment their eyes met, Lila knew something was wrong. She finished pouring coffee for a trucker before walking over to him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said softly. Dylan hesitated, glancing around the diner before lowering his voice. "We need to talk." They stepped outside, the sun glaring against the pavement, the hum of engines distant on the highway. Lila crossed her arms. "What is it?" He looked at her with a mixture of guilt and determination. "It's my father," he said. "He's the one buying the land. This diner, the gas stations, the motels, all of it. He's planning to tear everything down." She stared at him, blinking as if trying to process the words. "No," she whispered. "That can't be true." "I heard it myself," he said. "Last night, he called his partners. The sale goes through next week." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the diner, her eyes landing on the familiar red sign flickering in the distance. That sign had been her anchor, her sense of belonging. It wasn't just a building, it was her home, her second heartbeat. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Why would anyone want to destroy something that's still alive?" Dylan looked down, unable to meet her gaze. Because to him, it's not alive. It's numbers. It's profit. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind carried the faint whistle of a passing freight train somewhere far away. When she finally looked back at him, her eyes weren't angry, just sad. "You could have kept quiet," she said. "You could have let it happen, and I'd never know until it was too late." "I couldn't," he replied. "Not anymore." Inside the diner, Grizzly and a few of the other bikers were finishing breakfast. When Lila walked back in, her face pale, Grizzly immediately noticed. "What's wrong, Angel?" he asked, his voice cautious. She hesitated, then told them everything. The silence that followed was thick and cold. Grizzly set his cup down slowly. "Woods construction," he muttered, his tone like thunder, rolling low. I should have known. Dylan stood near the doorway, his head bowed, listening as the men exchanged dark looks. One of them slammed his fist against the counter. They can't just take it. This place has been here since the 40s. Another added, they'll pave it over and call it progress. Grizzly looked at Dylan. You knew about this? Not until last night, Dylan said quietly, and I'm going to stop him. Grizzly leaned back, studying him. And how's one rich boy planning to stop a man with an army of lawyers? Dylan met his gaze without flinching. Not alone. For the first time, a spark of respect flickered in Grizzly's eyes. Good answer, he said. Then turning to the others, he added, if Woods wants a fight, he's got one. But we'll do it the right way. No violence, no trouble. We'll do it the way she would. He nodded toward Lila. She shook her head, overwhelmed. You don't have to. We do, he interrupted gently. You've stood for us when nobody else did. It's our turn. By the end of the day, the diner had become the heart of something larger than anyone expected. Flyers were printed, calls were made. News spread across the county faster than the roar of a Harley. Save Route 66 Diner was written in bold red letters on cardboard signs, taped to windows, pinned to truck stops, shared on every local radio station. People came from nearby towns, not for coffee or pie, but to sign petitions, to show support, to stand for something real. Lila watched it all from behind the counter, her emotions swirling between disbelief and gratitude. Dylan worked beside her, helping coordinate volunteers, answering calls, speaking to local journalists who arrived to film the story. It was strange to see him that way, his hair messy, sleeves rolled up, voice steady as he spoke about preserving history, community, and dignity. He was no longer the boy who had walked in snapping his fingers for service. He was someone else now, someone she could finally understand. Late in the evening, after everyone had gone home, Lila sat in the quiet diner, the petitions stacked neatly on the counter. Dylan approached her, wiping his hands on a rag. You should rest, he said. It's just beginning, she replied. Tomorrow will be worse. Then we'll face it together. She looked at him and smiled faintly. You really mean that? I do, he said. I used to think people like you needed saving. Turns out it was me who did. The next morning, the diner parking lot was full. Reporters, townspeople, and bikers gathered under the blazing sun. A makeshift stage had been set up beside the sign. Grizzly stood before the crowd, his presence commanding. This diner isn't just walls and a roof, he said, his voice booming. It's part of this road's soul. It's where travelers rest, where families eat, where kindness still means something. And we won't let greed erase that. Applause erupted, cheers echoing across the asphalt. Lila stood beside him, humbled and proud, while Dylan stood just behind her, silent but steadfast. Then amid the noise, a convoy of black SUVs appeared again, gliding down the road like a dark omen. The crowd quieted. The vehicle stopped, and from the lead car stepped a man in a tailored suit, silver hair slicked back, the unmistakable presence of power. Mr. Woods. He surveyed the scene with cool disdain before walking toward the diner. This is private property, he said, his voice firm but smooth. You're trespassing. Grizzly crossed his arms. Funny. Looks like a public highway to me. Lila stepped forward. Mr. Woods, please, she said, her tone calm but resolute. This diner is my life. It's not just a business. It's a piece of who we are. Please don't destroy it. He looked at her as though she were a child asking for something foolish. Young lady, sentiment doesn't build the future. Progress does. Before she could respond, another voice cut through the silence. Progress without humanity isn't progress at all. The crowd turned. Dylan stepped forward. His father's expression hardened. Dylan, get back in the car. No, Dylan said, his voice steady. You can buy land, but you can't buy respect. You taught me to win, but you never taught me to care. These people did. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Cameras flashed. Mr. Woods' jaw tightened. You're embarrassing yourself, he said. Maybe, Dylan replied, but I'd rather be embarrassed than heartless. It was the first time in years that Mr. Woods looked uncertain. The crowd erupted in applause. Lila watched, tears welling in her eyes as the moment unfolded before her. The son defying his father, the town standing united, the sound of motorcycles roaring in solidarity behind them. For the first time in her life, she saw justice not as an abstract idea, but as something alive, beating like the heart of the road itself. Under the pressure of the cameras, the petitions, and the public outcry, Mr. Woods could do nothing but retreat. "We'll discuss this later," he muttered before turning back to his car. The SUVs drove away, leaving behind the sound of cheering and the smell of freedom in the hot afternoon air. That night, when the diner finally closed, the sign outside flickered brighter than usual. Lila stood at the window, watching the reflection of the lights in the glass. Dylan joined her, resting his hand gently on the counter. "You did it," he said quietly. "No," she replied, smiling through tears. "We did." Outside, the highway stretched into the horizon, calm and endless once more. For a brief, perfect moment, it felt like the world had found its balance again, a world where ordinary people could stand against power and win. But as they turned off the lights and locked the door, neither of them realized that the real victory wasn't the one they just won. It was the change that had taken place inside them, the discovery that respect, once earned, could outlive everything else. Months passed and Route 66 slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. The storms of protest, the reporters, the shouting crowds, all of it faded into memory, leaving behind something steadier and deeper than noise. The diner stood exactly where it always had, its neon sign glowing brighter now, freshly repaired and defiant against the desert sky. But the name had changed. The old Route 66 diner letters had been replaced by new ones, hand-painted with care. Second Chances Cafe. The first time Lila saw the new sign lit up at dusk, she stood in the parking lot for a long while, her mother beside her in a wheelchair, tears shining in both their eyes. It wasn't just a new name, it was a promise to herself, to the people who helped her fight, and to anyone who still believed in redemption. Inside, the cafe had transformed too, though not in the way big corporations change things, with chrome and perfection, but with warmth. The mismatched chairs were still there. The old jukebox still stuttered on the same verse, and the air still smelled of coffee and fried dough. Yet something new filled the space. Laughter, hope, and stories of people who had almost given up but hadn't. The cafe had become a refuge for those who needed a fresh start. Behind the counter worked people who once thought no one would ever give them one. There was Joe, a quiet man in his 40s with tattoos creeping up his neck, who had spent years in prison and now washed dishes with a kind of gratitude that made everyone else stop complaining. There was Maria, a young mother who came in one day begging for a part-time job and stayed because Lila saw the same weariness in her eyes that she used to see in her own. Even a shy teenage boy named Kenny, who used to hang around the parking lot asking for spare change, now wore an apron proudly, learning how to brew coffee without spilling it. Lila didn't just give them work, she gave them purpose. Each morning before opening, she stood in front of the window with her cup of coffee and watched the sunlight stretch over the empty road. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't fame, but it was hers. She'd built something that mattered. The locals still came as they always had, truckers, travelers, and families passing through. But now some stopped because they'd heard the story, about the waitress who stood her ground, the bikers who protected her, and the billionaire's son who changed. They came to see it, to believe that decency still existed somewhere in the world, and every once in a while, when the engines of Harleys rumbled in the distance, Lila's smile widened. The Hells Angels never stopped visiting. Grizzly Harris always took his usual seat by the window, ordering the same thing black coffee, no sugar, and pretending he didn't tear up every time he saw the new sign above the door. "You made it, Angel," he'd say in his gravelly voice. "We just helped you along the road." One afternoon, as she wiped the counter, she looked at the wall opposite the entrance. Hanging there was a large frame photograph taken the day after the protest. Lila standing between Grizzly, Dylan, and the rest of the bikers, all of them smiling in front of the diner. Beneath it, painted in bold black letters, were the words, "Respect has no color. Respect has no price." Every person who entered the cafe paused to look at it. Some smiled, some grew quiet, but all seemed to understand. Dylan had been gone for several months after the confrontation with his father. The last Lila heard, he'd left the city, refusing to work in the family business. He'd started a foundation instead, one that helped struggling youth find jobs, education, and housing. When she'd read about it in the newspaper, she'd smiled softly, knowing he had finally found his own road to walk. Still, part of her missed his presence, the quiet conversations at closing time, the way he used to hum along with the jukebox when he thought no one was listening. Then one late afternoon, when the sun painted the sky in streaks of orange and gold, the familiar sound of an engine made her heart skip. A black motorcycle turned onto the gravel drive, its rider wearing a simple leather jacket, not branded or loud. The engine cut off, and for a moment all she could hear was the wind rustling through the old highway signs. Dylan took off his helmet and smiled at her from across the lot. He looked older somehow, not in years but in presence. His posture no longer carried the arrogance of privilege, only quiet confidence. Lila stepped out to meet him. "Didn't expect to see you on two-wheel," she said, shading her eyes. He grinned. "Grizzly said I'd never understand the road until I felt it under my own hands." Guess he was right. She laughed softly. He usually is. Inside, they sat at their old table by the window, the same one where he'd once snapped his fingers to get her attention. Now he waited patiently while she poured his coffee. "Looks different," he said, glancing around the cafe. "Feels different, too." "Everything changes," she said, "sometimes for the better." He nodded, looking at the photograph on the wall. "You turned this place into something incredible, Lila. My dad might have built cities, but you built something that actually lasts." She smiled gently. "Your father's not my enemy, Dylan. He just forgot that people make places worth keeping." He sighed. "He's trying to remember. I think he regrets a lot. Maybe we both do." Outside, the familiar sound of motorcycles approached the Hells Angels, arriving as they always did on Fridays. They parked their bikes, their laughter filling the air as they walked in, nodding respectfully to Dylan before settling at their usual booth. "Look at you," Grizzly said when he saw Dylan. "Trading a suit for a bike. Didn't think you had it in you?" Dylan laughed. "You'd be surprised what a little humility can teach a man." The evening went on with laughter, stories, and the hum of the jukebox in the background. Lila moved between tables, her steps light, her heart full. When she returned to the counter, Dylan was looking out the window, lost in thought. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked quietly. She followed his gaze to the horizon, where the road stretched endlessly westward. "Sometime," she admitted. "But every time I think about going, someone walks through that door who needs a little kindness, and then I remember why I stayed." As the night deepened, the cafe emptied one by one, until only the bikers remained, finishing their last cups of coffee. Grizzly stood, tossed a few bills on the counter, and gave Lila a nod that carried more pride than words. "You did good, Angel. Real good." She smiled. "Couldn't have done it without you." "Nah," he said. "We just rode beside you a while. The road was always yours." When they finally left, the roar of their engines fading into the distance, Lila and Dylan stood at the doorway, watching the taillights vanish into the darkness. "You think it ever ends?" he asked. "The road?" She shook her head. "No, it just keeps going. Like respect, like hope. You just have to keep driving." They stood there in silence for a long moment, the desert wind brushing past them, carrying the faint scent of coffee and gasoline. The neon sign above flickered once, then glowed steady and bright against the night sky. For Lila, it was more than light, it was a heartbeat. A reminder that even on the loneliest stretches of highway, compassion could still shine through the dust. The next morning, the sun rose over the endless ribbon of Route 66, washing the cafe in gold. The world was quiet again, but inside Second Chance's cafe, the coffee was already brewing, the griddle already sizzling, and the sound of laughter waiting to return. Lila stood at the window with her mug, looking out at the road that had given her everything she never thought she'd find: purpose, family, and the courage to believe that kindness, once given, always finds its way back. And as the first customer of the day pushed open the door and the bell chimed softly, she turned with her warm, familiar smile and said, "Welcome to Second Chances. If this story moved you, don't scroll away just yet. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, because the next stories will challenge everything you think you know about kindness, courage, and redemption. Tap that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. And if you believe respect still matters in today's world, share this video with someone who needs to see it. And before you go, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what you would have done if you were in Lila's place. Because sometimes one simple act of kindness can change everything.